Make sure I'm not echoing.
Hey, welcome to Deeper Than Dogma. Tonight we are going to be talking about logical fallacies, especially in how they relate to the whole great debate community. Um, Whenever people engage in any type of discussion or argument where they want to propose a claim of some sort, it is important that the arguments are logically sound, and you try to avoid logical fallacies as much as possible. But why? What does that even mean? So hopefully to kind of explain that, and we have our panel here tonight, which consists of Floyd, Ozzy, Shanna, and Xbox, and our special guest tonight who suggested the topic for discussion, Benny Ocean.
Yeah.
So to start off, I'm going to toss us over to Ozzy, and he is going to give us a breakdown of what is a logical fallacy.
Okay, thanks. Well, I guess the first thing to be said is that the word fallacy or fallaciousness gets used in two senses. If you just say something that's false, if you say something like the population of Canada is greater than the population of China, which is, of course, incorrect, that's a falsehood. A person can say, well, that's fallacious, or they can say that's a fallacy. And there, all they're pointing to is that you've made a mistake. You've made a factual claim that is incorrect. So that's one sense of the word fallacy or fallaciousness. But the sense in which we're discussing it this evening is an error in reasoning, an error in argumentation, an error such that for whatever reason the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, either because there's something wrong with the form of the argument, or there's something wrong with one of the premises such that even if the form of the argument is correct, the conclusion isn't necessarily true because there's a fault somewhere in one or more of the premises. So an argument, of course, consists of premises. Premises are just assertions, they're just statements, which conform to a rule of inference, and they imply a conclusion. Ideally, that's what an argument is. An argument is an attempt to link together statements which imply that the conclusion is true if the premises are true. That's what you're trying to do anyway. So a fallacy has to be an argument. You can't be sort of committing this type of fallacy, the sort of fallacy that we're discussing this evening, unless you are actually putting forth an argument. And the reason this is important is because there's a lot of fallacies that we hear bandied about in the great debate and elsewhere, where people accuse one another of committing a fallacy when in fact they haven't committed a fallacy because they weren't putting forward an argument. For instance, if I say, Benny Ocean is, whatever, I don't know, a dumb guy, something. I insult him I insult his intelligence, or I insult his character in some way. I say he's just a greedy, selfish git. He's just a terrible person, right? If I say that while we're having an argument, that's not a fallacy. It would only be a fallacy if I said, because he's a selfish git and he's a dumb guy or something like that, because of that fact, his argument is wrong. Or if I were to try to, so there I would be trying to dismiss or discredit his argument by appealing to some fact about him. That's just an insult, though. That's not an argument. It's only an argument if I say, because of these character flaws that he has, that his argument is junk. Or if I were to say something about myself, I'm devilishly handsome, therefore my conclusion follows. That would be another kind of ad hominem directed at myself, a flattering one. If something is going to be a fallacy, an error in reasoning, a problem with an argument, if you are first and foremost making an argument, you have to be making an argument. But if you just insult someone, that's not an ad hominem fallacy. You haven't committed argumentum ad hominem there because you've just insulted them. It's just incidental. You happen to have insulted them. It's irrelevant, of course, but it's not a fallacy. So it's important to understand this because people will sometimes say, oh, you've committed the fallacy ad hominem, you've committed the fallacy of argumentum ad populum, appealing to the people or the populace or something like that, when in fact they've just made mention of it and they haven't based their argument on that claim. And so it's not a fallacy. So something is a fallacy only if it is an argument. It has to at least be an argument before the argument can be said to go wrong or can be said to be fallacious. Now, there are two ways that arguments can fail. For an argument to constitute a proof, the premises in the argument, that is the assumptions in the argument, have to be true. They have to be what we call sound. And the form of the argument has to be conforming to a rule of inference. So an argument to be a proof has to be both valid and sound. And validity has nothing to do with the truth of the premises. It just has to do with the form of the argument. For instance, if I say all men are bald, Ozzy is a man, therefore Ozzy is bald. That conclusion follows from the two premises I just gave. So that's a valid argument. It's valid because the conclusion follows from the premises. But of course, one of those premises was junk, right? All men are bald. That's false. That's a false premise. So that argument is incorrect. You've got a faulty conclusion there because it's logic and reasoning is garbage in, garbage out. It's a garbage in, garbage out process. So there's an error there not in the form of the reasoning, in the form of the argument, but in one of the premises. So an argument can fail in two ways. It can fail because one or more of the premises is false, and it can fail because, independently of that, if the form of the argument is incorrect. So what's an example of where the form of the argument can be incorrect? Well, consider something like if I say, if it rains, the street is wet. Okay? If it rains, the street is wet. It rains, therefore the street is wet. Well, there we go. That's a good, valid argument. That follows the form called modus ponens. A implies B. A therefore B. But someone could reason incorrectly. They could say the street is wet, therefore it rained. Right? They could go from A implies B, assert B, and then infer A, and that would be incorrect. That would be an error in the form of the argument. That's called a formal fallacy. When you violate one of the rules of inference, when you do not obey a rule of inference, when you ignore a rule of inference, then we say that the argument suffers from non sequitur. The conclusion doesn't strictly follow from the premises. The premises could all be true, but the conclusion isn't connected to the premises correctly because it violates or doesn't heed a rule of inference. So fallacies break down into two sorts. They break down into fallacies that are formal, that is, the logical form of the argument is not correct, and they break down into informal fallacies. Informal fallacies is when there's something wrong with the content of one or more of the premises. So an informal fallacy would be like the fallacy of equivocation. If I said, John's car is a lemon, because it's a defective car, it's a crappy car. John's car is a lemon. All lemons are yellow, therefore John's car is yellow. Right? Now, strictly speaking, the form of that argument is correct. John's car is a lemon, all lemons are yellow, therefore John's car is yellow. That follows perfectly. But the problem is that the word lemon is being used in two senses. It's being used to describe a faulty vehicle, and it's being used to describe a fruit. And so that's a fallacy of equivocation. So the form of the argument is correct, but there's something wrong with the content in the premises and in the conclusion. And so that's what we would call an informal argument. So for something to be a fallacious argument, it has to first and foremost at least be an argument, and it can fail in one of an argument can fail in one of two ways. It can be unsound, that is, have incorrect premises. It could also fail because it's invalid. It doesn't follow a rule of inference. And if you identify a fallacy, an error in the reasoning, it could be for one of two reasons. It could be a formal fallacy, that is, there's something wrong with the formal structure of the argument, or it could be an informal fallacy. There's something wrong in the content of the argument, quite apart from its structure, its logical structure. And one thing, I'll turn this over to other people now because I've had a lot to say here, but one thing that needs to be said when you're talking about fallacies is you have to make sure, if you accuse someone of committing a fallacy, that you know what the fallacy is. And it's not enough to say, you committed such and such a fallacy. You committed the fallacy of argumentum ad baculum or argumentum ad hominem or whatever. If you accuse someone of committing a fallacy, it behooves you to explain what the fallacy is and how what they said exhibits that fallacy. You can't just say you committed that fallacy and then dismiss their argument. You have to, in fact, be able to specify and explain to them or anyone who's listening.
What would you call that? You made a fallacy and I said, okay, you made a fallacy, but I didn't specify to it. How would you retort to that?
Well, I would say, well, if I didn't think I'd committed a fallacy, I would say, well, all you're doing is playing name that fallacy. You've named a fallacy. You've alleged that I've committed a fallacy, but you haven't bothered to specify what the fallacy is exactly and how what I have said exemplifies that fallacy. So, I mean, I jokingly call this the nominal fallacy. It's the name the fallacy, but I mean, really, it doesn't have a name that I know of. But
no, I like that. I think that's what I was wondering. That's if you had a simple retort.
Yeah, no, my retort is always, it behooves you, if you're going to accuse me of having committed a fallacy, to not just name a fallacy. You can't just sort of refer, invoke the name of some fallacy. You need to specify what the fallacy is, and then you need to explain how what I said exemplifies or instantiates that particular fallacy. Otherwise, you're not going to convince me that I've committed a fallacy. You're not going to convince anybody else. So we've got to sort of avoid that kind of mistake. If fallacies have to be explained, they can't just be named and alleged. It's not just it's not just a bucket of tar you can throw on a person and walk away. And the reason this is so important is because there's actually a fallacy called the fallacy, where a person will accuse a person of having committed a fallacy and then say, oh, well, you committed that fallacy, I can disregard your conclusion, anything else you say, I've discredited you. And that is completely incorrect. Just because a person commits a fallacy doesn't mean their position is wrong, their conclusion is wrong. It just means how they got to that conclusion was incorrect. They might have 10 other arguments that are perfectly good, right? Any argument, or rather any conclusion, any proposition, any conclusion, even a true one, that you might agree with, could be argued for badly and fallaciously. But just because someone commits a fallacy while arguing towards a conclusion doesn't mean the conclusion is false. You cannot infer that a conclusion is false just because they got there by faulty reasoning. The conclusion could still be correct. So all you're pointing to when you point out a fallacy, all you're indicating, all you're accusing a person of is faulty reasoning. You haven't demonstrated, by pointing out a fallacy, that their conclusion is incorrect. You've only pointed out that they didn't get there the right way. So when people think that naming a fallacy discredits a person or discredits a conclusion or a position, that's a mistake. That is itself a fallacy, and that is called the fallacy.
Well, thanks for that. Benny, you wanted to bring up this topic tonight. You were the one that put the suggestion there. Is the particular reason why that you want to tackle this, and what do you want to throw into add on to what Ozzy said?
Well, the people in the YouTube, religion debate community make a lot of mistakes in terms of the way they use fallacies and the way they talk about fallacies, and we talk around it, and we don't normally talk directly about it. So I thought, why not? And also, it's just good to have a resource, because sometimes when I've been a little bit irritated with people, I've told them, you don't understand this. You don't seem like you've spent any time looking into this at all. Go study the fallacies, learn what they are before accusing people of them, because a lot of people hear words like, argument from ignorance. I'll just use as an example. They think that argument from ignorance means that you're just saying, you don't know what you're talking about. Like you're ignorant. You don't know enough about this topic. But that's not what the argument from ignorance means, right? So the reason I wanted this, I wanted to have a video to reference people to sort of learn the basics, which Ozzy has laid out really well. If I'm not mistaken, the example he gave with the street is called affirming the consequent, right? It's what it does is it ignores other ways that the street could have gotten wet, right? It's like if the street is wet, did it rain, or did somebody leave a hose on, or there could have been somebody could have gone out with a bucket and just poured water in the street. There are other reasons, and the other the fallacy is actually kind of similar. It's like if P therefore Q, but we're saying P as a reason, P as an argument is bad, therefore Q the conclusion has to be wrong, which isn't the case. I mean, the conclusion could be wrong by pure luck. I mean, so you could still dispute their methods, but to say that they're wrong because their methods are wrong is a mistake. I have a list of open tabs here of fallacies we could talk about, but I'm going to pass it off to somebody else, and we'll come back around to me later. So
yeah, I think we covered the basics. I think we covered the basics there. I think Ozzy laid out a real good thing, and I think Floyd wanted to bring some particular stuff too. But that's cool with you, Sofman.
Yeah. Yeah. So Floyd, I know you wanted to add something else to that, and then you can jump into any particular fallacies that you actually want to bring up.
Yeah, I think the whole point behind this discussion is it's a commitment for all parties involved to be rational. So I think that's what this is about. You can have a person come in, and if they're not interested in being rational, they don't care about making valid arguments or sound arguments. So I think the reason we're here and what we're trying to encourage is we're encouraging people to be rational. If you have no commitment to be rational, then you wouldn't be even interested in logic and committing, trying to avoid logical fallacies. So I think when you're in a discussion with someone, I think it's kind of an assumed thing that we're both trying to be rational. Both sides are trying to be rational, and we're committed to that. I actually came across people that weren't even interested, and they had bad arguments, and you would point out the fallacious behind their arguments, and they really didn't care, and they'd use the argument the very next day. I think that's what we're trying to stop here.
Well, is there any particular fallacies that you want to bring up that you encounter quite often in these discussions?
Sure, I have a bunch. I'll start with one. It's the appeal to adverse consequences. I hear that from theists a lot. A common example. One example is from one of the top apologists in the world, William Lane Craig. He often uses the appeal to adverse consequences. One of his arguments is if there is no God and if there is no afterlife, then life has no meaning. Life has no ultimate meaning. That eventually we'll all be dead. The human race will be gone. The universe will eventually burn out, and anything that's going on right now, ultimately in the end, won't matter at all. And to that, I can say, well, so what?
Yeah, that's what I would
exactly.
say.
And it doesn't invalidate a naturalism or anything. It's just an appeal to a consequence that he doesn't like.
There's a hidden assumption. We don't want the universe to be this way, therefore it's not. Right? I mean, it's like there's an assumption that the universe can't be some way other than the way we want it to be. Why can't it be? I mean, if you don't like it, too bad for you, like Floyd said.
Yep.
The universe isn't under any obligation to, give us all existential bliss, to make us feel good about our place in the universe, and to make us feel important. These are some of the things that religion tries to do. It sort of tears people down and then sort of builds them back up. You're terrible, you're worthless, but God loves you, and He's, you can have this everlasting whatever. So, yeah, that's all.
Hey, real quick, I can hear someone's light music almost in the background, like a static sound of music. I muted the room on my end, and it's not coming for me. I don't know if the YouTube's picking it up. So just wanted to throw it out there in case someone knew what it was.
I don't hear anything.
No, I'm not hearing anything either. But one of the things that you brought up there was like the hidden assumptions, and in some of these fallacies as well, there are these hidden premises that people will actually throw in to them as well. Ozzy or Floyd or anybody, how do you deal with somebody that's throwing in hidden premises into their logical arguments?
Can you repeat that question again?
Well, sometimes sometimes I know in the discussions we have is that we're throwing in hidden premises into their fallacies as well?
Well, I think when two people engage, there's often assumptions. If you talk to someone about travel, for example, I think there's an assumption that like both you agree that the Earth is a sphere and not flat. There's some sort of neutral ground, and assumptions that we think that would be common sense or common knowledge. But there are times when you are mistaken about that, and I think for example, with dealing with presuppositionalists, they'll even claim there is no neutral ground between the presuppositionalist and his his opponent, the non-Christian, and so forth. But usually in normal discourse, there are hidden assumptions because we both typically both parties agree on common knowledge, like the physical universe exists, for example, that the Earth is round, that the Earth goes around the sun, and so forth. But you never know; you might come across a flat earther. So you do have to be aware of that.
Not to go off on too much of a tangent, but the precepts also mention what was it? They say you don't live consistent with that worldview, or you don't live consistent with that whatever. You live as if life has meaning, so you're living as if God exists. I don't exactly know. I don't know if that's a formal fallacy. I don't know if there's a fallacy involved there, but it's curious the way they're getting to that conclusion.
I think you can almost do it as the lemon thing that Ozzy was doing earlier. I think you could almost reduce it to that. That it's one of those that premise is just terrible. Give it a name. Start calling it that.
Just to answer your question earlier, Xbox, about what do you do if someone is smuggling in hidden premises? What you do is you call them on it. You point out very, very, very pointedly, this seems to be a hidden assumption in your argument. And then what you do is you challenge them. Just say, I'd like to hear how you make that argument go. Not assuming that, right? Just assume that that's not true. Now make your argument. See how well your argument flies now. And if they can't do that, then you can show that in fact their argument was tacitly or implicitly relying on that. And that happens all the time. We are all guilty of smuggling in hidden assumptions. And I mean, it's okay, as Floyd said, so long as everyone shares the assumptions, then for the purposes of the argument, you're saying, okay, well, you're granting me this, good, let's proceed from there. And that's perfectly okay. But of course, if your opponent doesn't grant that assumption, and now you've got a problem, because now you've got a premise in your argument, and you're trying to persuade a person, and they're not granting you one of the premises. Now you have to go and support that premise. And of course, sometimes the premise is one of the things that's at issue between you. It's one of the big issues between you, and so
like the other night, one of the premises coming from a theist was God exists. That was the first premise.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's okay. I mean, it's okay to say God exists as a premise if you're talking to someone who shares that, or who will say, okay, for the purposes of argument, that is arguendo, for the purposes of argument, I will grant that God exists, and then we'll see where we go from there. I mean, I do that many times. I mean, everybody.
I grant all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, you just.
But if I disputed it, though, then you would have to go in and defend that premise, like you were saying.
Yeah.
I think actually, that's what I was thinking of.
That brings to mind a mistake that people make all the time. It's kind of a weird. It's so mule-headed. I don't know what to think of it when I hear it. Sometimes you will be arguing with a person, and you'll say, okay, well, I don't think that that's true, that premise, okay, but let's grant that premise for the sake of argument. Let's see where we can go from that. Let's see how far you can get. Where can this argument take you if we assume that premise is true? And so you'll say, I assume that premise is true for the sake of argument, arguendo. And so you go, And then at some point you can, say, okay, well that's fine. Then we've explored that, but I got to say I don't grant I never granted that premise. Really, I granted it for the sake of the argument to see where the argument goes. And then some people will just say, well, no, you can't do that. You're backpedaling now. You said you granted it. Well, no, I granted it for the sake of the argument. Dummy.
Yeah, that's why I had to, y'all had to help me word that when I was going into a debate about intelligent design. And I was saying it in a way that I would have been backpedaling. So y'all helped me out with that argument, innuendo, is that what I said?
Arguendo, yeah. Arguendo. It just means, it's Latin. It just means for the sake of the argument.
Yep.
Right. So you're just saying, look, I'm gonna pretend. Let's play make believe, and I'm gonna pretend that I believe this premise, and then I'm gonna argue with you within the scope of that assumption. I'm granting you that premise for the sake of the argument, to see where it goes, just to explore it as an intellectual undertaking and attempt at exploring what work you can do intellectually within the scope of certain assumptions, and that's perfectly okay. But of course, when you say that, I'm granting that premise arguendo, or for the sake of argument, you're not committed to actually believing it. You're not saying that you actually believe it, and so of course at any point you can say, okay, well, all right, now I see where it goes. Now, I grant that you can get to that conclusion that you wanted to get to if we assume that. But I don't actually assume that, and you can get off at any point. There's no hypocrisy. You're not backpedaling or anything of the kind. But some people really try to trap you into conceding a point for the purposes of argument, and then once you do, they think that they've got you, and they use it as a gotcha.
Yep. Yeah, and I do like taking that end of it and running through it with them instead of arguing over that premise for an hour.
Now, Aaron, you have an interesting position in this too, because you're, I believe, you are the only theist in the room. Is there any argument? Well, we have a deist as well.
Sure.
But you're the. What arguments do you come across a lot that you see that atheists make, or any type of fallacies that they're making that you'd really like them to stop?
Well, one big one is which we already went over, which apparently a lot of theists use, because a lot of theists do use this, the argument from adverse consequences. That's used a lot of times on the atheist side, saying, look at all these atrocities in the Old Testament, look at all this stuff dealing with the Old Testament law, this God seems evil and bad, therefore doesn't this make you want to not believe this is true?
Right.
Which it shouldn't. It shouldn't have any bearing whatsoever on your actual belief one way or the other on God's existence. It might have something to do, it might have implications on whether you should worship him or love him or obey him or anything or something like that. But
yeah, I wish they'd stop that.
But wouldn't the fallacy there? It wouldn't necessarily be the adverse or the things happening in the world, but more if it contradicts with the characteristics that people are putting and attaching to that. That might be the point that people are addressing there.
Yeah, I mean that's the argument I basically make, saying this God is supposed to be the standard of goodness, the standard of love, and so forth. Yet he doesn't act that way. But again, that God could certainly exist, but he wouldn't be what we consider to be a good God.
Yeah, but I think Aaron is.
Oh, sorry. Could I say one thing? I certainly wouldn't mind if they would just say, yeah, we worship an evil God. He's evil, but he's the boss. He's in charge, so we just have to worship him anyway.
Right.
If they were to say that, that'd be fine.
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
Some Calvinists go that far and say exactly that.
They wouldn't have to say evil, but when they're going to use words like benevolent.
Beckles called him monster and such like that from our perspective. That's the argument I actually got in with him and agreed with him through the whole thing, or he agreed with me.
The point that Aaron is making, though, I think is different. It's not whether this God is worthy of worship, because I mean, if a person is saying that God has all perfections and he's morally good, and then you can point out that there are all these evil things that he seems to have done, then that's not a fallacy. You are in fact showing what is by your lights a contradiction, a fact about what this God is alleged to have done that contradicts what is being said about his moral nature. So that's not a fallacy there. But what's a fallacy of adverse consequences is when someone like Christopher Hitchens who would do this all the time. He would talk about, what will happen if everyone believes this? Look what happens when people believe this. Look at all the terrible things that people do when they believe these preposterous things, as he sees it, right? Now that actually is an appeal to adverse consequences. That's an ad baculum
Appeal
argument.
to emotion also.
And also an appeal to emotion, yeah. But so it's an appeal to emotion and it's an appeal to adverse consequence. But just the fact that if people come to believe something, they will do bad things. Doesn't mean that the belief is incorrect, right? They might be right to believe it, and yes, and it might have dire consequences or not. But you can't sort of appeal to the fact that if enough people believe a certain religion, all hell will break loose. Because that's not an argument. Therefore you shouldn't believe that it's true. That simply does not follow. That is a fallacious argument, and someone like Christopher Hitchens was smart enough to know better, and I'm sure he did know better. But there, I think he was in fact appealing to emotion there, and that was sort of his rhetorical strategy. It was the art of persuasion at work there, rather than valid and sound reasoning.
Well, just because you already brought it up, appeal to emotion. When does a logical argument cross over into that realm when it becomes an appeal to emotion?
When it's not, when the premises don't lead to the conclusion, but you're trying to elicit an emotional reaction of some kind. You're trying to make someone feel some way, put them in a state that's going to be more sympathetic to your position.
Yes.
Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, basically what you do is you take a look at the conclusion and you ignore the premises. You take a look at the conclusion and say, doesn't this conclusion make you have some type of negative emotional reaction? And then use that as some means of persuasion to say, therefore we shouldn't believe this. Like it's like saying that,
right?
Do what?
You can be positive too, though, right? Like
it can be positive. Yeah, that's another one. Theists do this a lot because don't you want to see your loved ones again? After you die, don't you want to see all these good things? Don't you want to have hope in your life? That's another one that theists do a lot. And it's an appeal to emotion. It's not actually a sound argument.
Yeah, if there's no God, then Hitler and a baby end up in the same state. Hitler won't be punished for his actions.
Very good example.
There's no ultimate judge.
People need cosmic justice. They want to believe in cosmic justice, and so they'll take whatever gets them there.
Right, and an atheist, you can do the same thing where you say, well, I don't want to have moral accountability to any being after I die. I want to live as I please or whatever. The I'm an atheist because I want to sin kind of mindset. You could make that argument to someone and then make them feel guilty because they have a very restrictive religious practice on diet and things you can do, things you can eat and all that other stuff. And every aspect of your life is very strict, and you don't want to be under that anymore. And so you appeal to that emotion of, don't you want to be free of this? But it's not actually an argument against any premise that led you to
it's not an argument against God's existence. It's an argument against why you want to follow God, because you're more interested in your hedonism, right? I just want my pleasure, and so God's getting in the way, right? It's not an argument, not a good argument.
I've heard an argument like that made against deism. I mean, Shanna's in the room; she's a deist. Maybe she'll speak to this. She cares to, but I mean, I hear that kind of move made against deists all the time. You worship a god that doesn't lay down any specific rules on how we ought to live. There's no promise of an afterlife or anything like that. None of the goodies that come with traditional theistic religions and a personal God and revealed divine knowledge. None of that sort of comes with your deism. Therefore, there's something wrong with your deism. That's kind of a weird argument, but there's an appeal to emotion there, and an appeal to dire consequences. One of the dire consequences being that it doesn't prescribe how to live. And if everyone were a deist, it'd just be like everyone being an atheist or an agnostic. If there aren't divine marching orders, anything goes. Everything is permitted, right? And that whole argument about if there's no God who prescribes what you ought to do. then all hell will break loose and life will become meaningless and there's no right and wrong and everything is permitted, as William Lane Craig likes to repeat. That is an ad baculum argument and an appeal to emotion. That conclusion simply doesn't follow.
Hey, Ozzy, did you? I might have missed it. I think you didn't say anything about the non sequitur fallacy in your introduction. Do you want to tell us about the thing you were saying yesterday?
Yeah. Well, non sequitur.
What is not? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I heard this recently in a hangout that Benny here was actually, and someone was saying, you've committed the fallacy of non sequitur. Well, listen. Anytime someone commits a formal fallacy where their conclusion doesn't follow from their premises, they've committed a non sequitur. Non sequitur isn't the name of a fallacy. Virtually every fallacy is committing a non sequitur. A non sequitur just means it doesn't follow. It just means the conclusion doesn't follow. So when you accuse someone of committing a non sequitur, all you're saying is your conclusion doesn't follow from your premises, right? But it's not a species of fallacy. It's not a specific type of fallacy. It's not the name of a fallacy. It's rather the reason why anything is a fallacy. So when someone says you've committed the fallacy of non sequitur, they don't know what they're talking about. They haven't looked up fallacies. Now, non sequitur, it gets used in two ways. It gets used by logicians specifically to refer to a violation of an inference rule in formal logic, so that it's a problem with a formal argument only. But we also use it more loosely to refer to any time a conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, even when the problem is just an unsound or untrue premise. Because if one of the premises is false, then of course the conclusion is not going to be necessarily true. It might be true by luck, but not be true by virtue of what's been argued. And so non sequitur can be used in a restrictive sense to refer only to formal violations of formal logic in the form of the argument, but it's also used more loosely to refer to anything, any screw up in the argument, whether it's a formal fallacy or an informal fallacy. So a non sequitur isn't the name of a fallacy. A non sequitur just means that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises for whatever reason, and consequently you're not naming a fallacy when you accuse someone of non sequitur. Well, all you're saying is your conclusion doesn't follow. You haven't specified anything wrong. And so when I hear people say, "Oh, you've committed the fallacy of non sequitur," I know that they don't know what they're talking about. So it's important to keep that in mind. Non sequitur just means doesn't follow in the sequence. The conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. There's something wrong in the argument.
It's the equivalent of just saying you just committed a fallacy and not actually specifying what it was.
Right. Yeah. You're saying there's something fallacious about your argument. Big deal. Yeah. You've got to specify now where the error is and how I've exemplified that error.
Floyd, I know you have a list of other fallacies that you want to bring up. What's the next one that you have for us?
Well, a very common one. This is one that anyone can use when they're basically losing a debate. They're doing lousy debate. Their arguments are getting shot down one after another. So what do you do when you're in that position? You appeal to universal skepticism. And universal skepticism basically is the claim that all epistemological positions and reason itself ultimately relies on faith. So any argument, any position itself, you can be skeptical about because you can just say, oh well, you cannot ultimately prove that. Yeah, that's what philosopher Stephen Law calls going nuclear. You throw the skeptical card in, and you can deny everything. And if I say the Earth is round, and you're a flat earther, you can say, well, you could argue, well, how do you know that? Well, because we observe it, we have satellites that circle it, we've flown around the Earth, and so well, how do you know that? How do you know that? So, well, I see it. Well, how do you know your eyesight is valid? You'll hear that from presuppositionalists a lot. And how do you know? How do you know? How do you know? You can just be skeptical. You can be skeptical of everything, and so that kind of puts all arguments, all positions on the same level. So at that point, you really can't get anywhere.
It's one of those ones that you have no choice really but to walk away from.
Right, right. And yeah, I mean, you really get into epistemology at that point, and foundations of knowledge, and you start talking about foundationalism or coherentism and all that stuff. That's that's where a lot of debates end up. This ends up ended up in a deep philosophical debate. A lot of times, when debates turn into, how do you know that, or turns into a discussion about epistemology, that the original topic is pretty much done and over with.
No, it's one of the reasons why I dislike going down the presupposition route, because that's where you're going to see this argument a lot, is because it is a rabbit trail that's going to take you off of whatever conversation, whatever you're talking about, for an hour, 2 hours. They can pretty much go as long as they want and not actually answer what the original topic was.
Yeah. I could talk about fallacy. Ozzy already brought up the fallacy, and that's someone actually accused me of that recently. The fallacy is when you show an argument is invalid, you thus claim that the proposition is therefore false, which is a fallacy. You can have one bad argument after another. That doesn't necessarily mean that the proposition is false. But I heard someone say, well, it doesn't matter what arguments you have. My proposition that my God exists is still true. And that's what's called the fallacy. Three fallacies. And what the fallacy is a claim that disproving particular arguments or versions of position is irrelevant to disproving the position itself. So thus you're saying, I have this position, and no matter what good arguments you have to disprove it, you still can't claim my position's false. So it doesn't matter what arguments you have. My position is true nonetheless. Again, disproving, showing an argument that the arguments a person has doesn't show that the position is false, but it simply shows that that person doesn't have any good reason, any rational reason to hold that position. But for them to claim that it still doesn't matter, my position still could be true. It really doesn't matter, what arguments you have against it.
I've actually heard that one a lot from people who use the. These are people. They'll reduce theism to. These are a bunch of people who are arguing that there's an invisible sky daddy, and so I don't care what kind of logical arguments you've got. I don't care what kind of evidence you've got. You're still sitting here arguing for some magical guy in the sky waving a magic wand, and so I don't really have to take anything you say seriously. That's one of the ways I've heard it used.
Mm-hmm.
Which fallacy was that again?
Well, the one I brought up was the fallacy.
Sounds like an appeal to ridicule. I mean, I'm not exactly...
Yeah. There's also, if you misuse the fallacy, that's called the fallacy.
Floyd's getting carried away.
Yeah. And then if you misuse that, you add another fallacy, and
you're going to have to add exponents to make make it clear.
Floyd, you're cut off. You got to hand us your keys. You're not driving.
Yeah.
Well, one of the fallacies that we wanted to bring up here was the that I think Benny's going to talk about here is the appeal to authority, because this one gets thrown out all the time. That just because not every single appeal to authority is an appeal to authority. There are valid forms of it. Benny, can you go into that a little bit more?
Well, sure. I think Ozzy had probably more to say about it. We talked about this a little bit off air yesterday, but I'll just give you an example. Like somebody was asking me, well, what's your definition of X? This thing, and it was a philosophical term, and I was saying, well, I normally would use something like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy if you wanted to find out about what do philosophers think about this subject? How has it traditionally been understood by academia or by theologians? Or go to the source. Have some kind of a resource you can use. And I was told, well, you're appealing to authority by looking it up in the SCP. And I'm thinking, what? I mean, it's like these are the experts on this topic. It's not fallacious to go to Harvard website, Harvard medical, and to learn medical knowledge from Harvard Medical. If that's fallacious, then pretty much every form of learning we do would be fallacious, because we have to learn from basically authorities no matter where we go. But the invalid appeal to authority, Ozzy, how did you draw the distinction? You had a good way of putting it yesterday when we talked about this.
Oh, yeah. Well, we have to, the distinction is between a mere appeal to authority versus an appeal to relevant expertise. What makes someone an authority is that they have relevant expertise in some domain of knowledge. Okay? So it's the difference between saying some proposition X is true because Smith said it, okay, which would be a fallacy, right? It's true because so-and-so said it, and he's Smith, and that would be illegitimate, right? It's the difference between saying that and saying, I have a good reason to believe that X is true because Smith, who is a relevant expert about X, okay, said it. And so because of his relevant expertise, not who he is, but what he knows, right, Smith is better positioned to know about X, and so then I have a warrant to trust Smith's opinion about X. Right? And we do this all the time. I mean, it's funny, just today someone asked me, what do I think about the, how do I feel about what historians and textual critics and biblical scholars think about the dating of the Gospels and the New Testament texts, the others like the epistles and the Gospels and all those. And what I said was, well, I'm just not qualified to second guess the consensus of textual critics and biblical scholars, historians, papyrologists, and linguists who specialize in ancient languages. I simply have to trust their expertise here, and so I just go with them, right? Just as I do with most of what goes on in science. I trust the relevant experts. I'm not in a position to second guess them. That doesn't mean I have to blindly agree with everything they say. If something strikes me as wrong and I have a reason for thinking they're wrong, I can call it into question, right? You don't have to blindly and slavishly adhere to what they say because they are experts. But it's perfectly legitimate to say, well, listen, I don't have any expertise in this. You don't have any expertise in this. But there's a whole group of people who are experts in this, who devote their lives to studying this. Doesn't it make sense to appeal to them, given our relative ignorance on the question? So if I'm arguing evolution with someone, I know a little bit about evolution, but I'm not a biologist. And even if I were a biologist, it wouldn't mean that I'm an expert in the subject of evolution. So if I'm not an expert in the subject of evolution, and you're not an expert in the subject of evolution, and we disagree on the subject, what we have to do is defer to the experts on the subject. It doesn't mean you have to sort of bow down and say, oh well, some expert said it. But what you're doing is you're appealing. You're saying, listen, we have to sort of bracket our skepticism somewhat here and appeal to relevant expertise. That's what you're really appealing to when you're appealing legitimately to authority. You're appealing to legitimate expertise, and you're hoping that the other person recognizes the legitimate expertise of the authority in question. Now, there are cases that are kind of funny, though, because you could say, for instance, well, I believe in astrology, and the other person says, I don't believe in astrology. And I say, oh yeah, well I do. And then I could say, well, let me show you all these astrologers. There's all these people who've devoted themselves to the field of astrology. They've devoted their whole lives to studying astrology. And astrology's been around for a long time, right? Well, what's going on there is I'm appealing to authority, but the question is there really a domain of knowledge there? Is there anything to astrology about which you can be an expert? Is there any there? Or is it all just, is this a case of the emperor having no clothes? And so even when you appeal to what by your lights is an authority, the other person can still say, you know what, I don't think those are authorities. I don't think anyone is in a position to be an authority here because I don't think there's a relevant domain of expertise here because I don't think there's a relevant domain of knowledge here. So it's actually quite complicated sorting out this informal fallacy of an appeal to an authority. Really, what you're doing when you're appealing to an authority at bottom is you're saying, listen, you and I both agree that we're not experts in this, but we both hopefully recognize that there are experts. So we need to defer to them unless we have a good reason to doubt what they're saying. And you can have good reasons to doubt what the experts are saying. The experts can and sometimes are wrong. So it's actually quite thorny. It's not. This is not a black and white issue. In fact, when it comes to informal fallacies, very often they're not black and white. And the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate appeals to authority is one of the grayest ones, because you really are asking the other person to grant you some assumptions here, namely that there is a domain of knowledge, that there are relevant experts in this domain of knowledge, and that the people you're invoking as authorities have the relevant expertise in that domain of knowledge.
Now, one of the things that kind of with going along with the appeal to authority and that some fallacies might not necessarily be fallacies. Aaron wanted to touch on that as well, bringing up a couple of examples there.
Yeah. Appeal to authority is one of those where there's a such thing as potentially valid appeal to authority, as long as both people grant the authority and everything that Ozzy just went into. Another one is an argument from silence, where you'll say, here's something that I don't see that I'm positing that we should expect to see. Here's something we don't see, therefore we don't. Therefore, the thing that we're saying causes it is not there, which is perfectly valid if you have a strong reason to believe that you actually should be seeing this secondary effect. One example is in the dating of certain books of the New Testament. There's an argument that the book of John, or one of the books of the Bible, doesn't mention Sadducees, whereas the other ones do, or as several other ones do, and they mention it more times. Therefore, since they don't mention Sadducees, then they must have been significantly after AD 70 to have forgotten about Sadducees as the dominant players in Judaism. Or the argument from the other side, this is an argument from silence, is saying that none of the books of the New Testament mention AD 70 as a past event. They all mention AD 70. None of them talk about the actual destruction of the temple as if it had already happened, and therefore all of the books of the New Testament, or any of them, were written prior to AD 70. Well, both of these are arguments from silence, and you have to actually give a strong justification for why this silence is actually significant. An exodus of 2 million people should have left something behind. Therefore, it's actually fair to say we haven't found anything that would be, it was obvious there would have been something if 2 million people were in the desert roaming around for 40 years? We would have seen something. But if it was a smaller group of people in a nomadic tribe, not leaving anything behind and not having, places and things to write about, maybe it was a different period of time because the journey itself is not all that far for 40 years, then you shouldn't actually be finding the things that you're looking for. You can disprove a 2 million Jew exodus, but you can't disprove the other one on the same argument from silence.
Well, not to get too deep into the argument. Aren't there other books besides just the Bible that actually, if you took that as the Bible's evidence, that you could take these other books of their stories that actually include that 40-year journey?
No, there aren't any. The story of the Exodus. The story of the Exodus is really only in Exodus. It's not.
There was something about, and it was on Ancient Aliens. I don't take for the mana machine. It was talking about the mana machine, but that came from a text, and I thought they said it was a different text than the Bible, but it talked about when they roamed around in the desert for 40 years. And it might have been from the Exodus. Maybe they read and figured out how to build that mana machine from the Exodus. I have no idea.
That's called the appeal to terrible cable programming, by the way.
The arcane fallacy.
I'd like to pick up on a point that Aaron brought up, because what he's articulating there is how, with this argument from silence. An argument from silence is sometimes a good argument and sometimes not, and it all has to do with when you should expect to find evidence. And we often hear it, you'll hear people repeat this all the time, and this is a terrible argument. They'll say, an absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Okay, now that's incorrect. An absence of evidence is not proof of absence, of course, but when evidence which one would expect to be present is absent, then that is an absence of evidence which constitutes evidence of the absence of something.
All right.
That's what else could possibly be evidence of the absence of something other than an absence of evidence for that thing, right? But it's got to be an absence of evidence where you would expect to find that evidence.
Right.
So I like to give the example of Bigfoot. Like, why are we so confident that Bigfoot is mythical and not a real creature? It's because we don't find any dead bodies. We don't find any living specimens. We've never seen one drowned in a river. We've never seen one frozen in the snow. We've never seen one shot by a hunter, hit by a car, hit by a train, killed by a predator, died of a disease. We find no stools, we find no hair, we find no blood, there's no DNA. All we find are easily faked footprints and blurry photographs and videos, all of which could be easily faked. And the kind of evidence that we should expect to find if Bigfoot were real, that's what's missing. That is an absence of evidence that bespeaks evidence of the absence of Bigfoot.
Yeah. I use that on the flood of not finding people fossils, where if they're expecting to find these other animal fossils during the flood, there should be people fossils as well, and we don't find them.
Oh yeah.
Benny, you wanted to go on about another fallacy.
Yeah, the genetic fallacy. So I've said this before. I have two Christians, and so maybe I'm guilty of it, or some cousin of that. But faith as a method seems like it can lead you anywhere, and it's entirely dependent on, as people have pointed out, geography and who your parents are, and just the tradition of your. I mean, it's sort of it's related to an appeal to tradition. You're trusting the religion that was handed down to you is you're relying on the faith tradition of whichever culture you're a member of, but the genetic fallacy is this idea that you can't say that somebody is wrong because they reach their conclusion through a certain method. They could have used a certain method and still, you could use faith, which shows itself to be unreliable based on, the numbers. But you could use faith and just rely, you could reach the right conclusion by chance. So I feel like it's a valid criticism. I want to ask, Ozzy or Floyd maybe has something to say about this, is I feel like it's a reasonable criticism to point out that faith is so unreliable, but there is also a component of the genetic fallacy there also. So this question isn't really polished, but if anybody wants to chime in on it, thank you.
Well, yeah, usually with the genetic fallacy, it's an argument of, where the argument comes from invalidates the claim. So if I said, for example, Adolf Hitler said 2 + 2 is 4, therefore that's false because it comes from Adolf Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a genetic fallacy, we hear that a lot from theists that claim, if something comes from nature or evolution or something, therefore it's no good. There has to be a supernatural explanation for it. It has to be a transcendent explanation. That's usually how a genetic fallacy is used. It's criticizing the source of the claim rather than addressing the claim itself.
I'm seeing a lot of parallels. To me, it seems a lot like ad hominem in a way, right? It's like this, what he just said about Hitler. Well, can't believe Hitler, even if he's right about math. So, go ahead, Ozzy.
How can morals exist if you're just a bag of chemicals?
Right.
Well, that's
fallacy of composition.
Composition, if we wanted to, yeah.
No, but it's also a genetic fallacy. Remember, there can be more than one fallacy operative at once, right? An argument can be swaddled in many blankets of fallacies, layers and layers of fallacy. And the only thing I wanted to add to the genetic fallacy, for people who wonder, well, why is it called a genetic fallacy? It's because it's the fallacy of origin. It's the origin of the argument, where the argument comes from, where the argument issues from, the source of the argument, somehow contaminates or pollutes the conclusion. And that's not true. You can't do that. You can't say, oh, so and so is a woman. You know what women are like. You can't trust anything they say, right? Therefore, the argument is junk and the conclusion is junk. You can't argue that way. That would be another kind of genetic fallacy. That would also be, at the same time, an ad hominem argument, because you're saying, Sally is a woman, and you're pointing to some fact about her, namely her womanhood, to somehow discredit or impugn or undermine or undercut her conclusion. So a lot of these go together,
I'm waiting for a hand to come off screen and whack you.
It could happen.
But one of the ones you actually just brought up there, Floyd, was the fallacy of composition.
Right. Yeah. Hear from a theist, against naturalism. So if naturalism is true, we're nothing but a bag of DNA or a bag of chemicals, and or a bag of atoms of matter, and atoms, matter can't think, can't do anything, and it's just fallacious. Matter arranged a certain way can do a lot. It's like saying, oh, well, a computer is just a bunch of silicone, metal and plastic, or a car is just a bunch of plastic, metal and gasoline and so forth. That can't do anything. Well, assembled a certain way, it can do a lot. Mm-hmm. So it's saying that since the properties of the parts cannot do something, the sum of the parts cannot do that something as well.
Right. Yeah.
No, yes.
And you don't need emergence in that either.
Right, but it's not necessarily fallacious when you're using it in terms of that, and it could be, but it's not necessarily, because if I were to give you an example, here's a big tub of water, and I say this tub of water can think, and you say this tub of water, this is just water. Water can't think. And I say, okay, well, let me add more water. And once you add to a certain level, it'll start thinking. And you say, no, it's just water. The whole thing is just water. I can't get, I don't care how much water you add, you're never going to get water to think, because water is not something that has the properties of being able to think, no matter how much you have of it. And so it's not necessarily a fallacy of composition to say that chemicals can't just produce this kind of consciousness simply because they're chemicals. You would have to be able to demonstrate just how that emergent property comes about. That actually is something that I think someone on naturalism should be able to have an idea for, or have evidence that it has. You can't just simply say, well, chemicals can do things when you add them together enough. I think it is at least a valid objection to say, how are these chemicals coming together going to produce an emergent property where a whole group of particles is thinking itself as one organism and experiencing things?
Yeah.
So I don't think that's necessarily fallacious.
It's only fallacious if a person says that you couldn't get there. You couldn't produce consciousness, or you couldn't produce, whatever. I mean, imagine if a person were to say, look at H2O molecules. Look at an individual H2O molecule. An individual H2O molecule is not wet, right? Therefore, and if you take two H2O molecules side by side, they're not wet either. And if you take three, and so you keep going, and then next thing you know, you're saying no amount of H2O molecules, no matter how they're interacting with each other, will ever be wet. Well, okay, H2O molecules won't be wet, but that doesn't mean that water isn't wet. But water is made entirely of H2O molecules. So the fallacy of the composition here is what a person is doing is they're looking at the individual parts of a thing, the component or constituent parts of a whole, and saying the constituent parts don't have a property that the whole has, and therefore the whole can't have anything that the parts don't have. It's like saying that because a mosaic or any well, I'm not going to say mosaic, it's a bit obscure, but yeah, a jigsaw puzzle. I have a jigsaw puzzle. The jigsaw puzzle pieces are all very, very small. Every piece in the jigsaw puzzle is very, very small. Therefore, the whole jigsaw puzzle, is small, but it could be a million-piece jigsaw puzzle, and it could be huge. It could take up, like, a neighborhood. So that's where the fallacy is. It's not that there's no fallacy when a person says, well, wait a minute, I don't know how you get from a collection of neurons, none of which think, to aggregated a certain way, they can think. That does cry out for an explanation. You are entitled to say, how does this happen? And a person who says, yes, it does happen, has to give a reason why they think that the matter so organized is able to think. But what you can't argue is that it couldn't think simply because an individual neuron can't think. That is what you cannot do. That's where the fallacy is. Remember, with fallacies, all you're trying to do is point out that the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow from the premises. What you're not trying to do is prove that therefore the conclusion has to be false. The conclusion doesn't have to be false, right? But you can use arguments to point out fallacies to undercut a person's confidence in a conclusion by showing that they didn't get to their conclusion correctly, but you don't establish that the conclusion is false. And so you can't establish that brains can't think or that water isn't wet by looking at the constituent parts and pointing out that neurons don't think and individual H2O molecules aren't wet. But that's what you can't do, right? You can't go as far as saying water, the liquid feature of water, the liquidity or the wetness of water could never be explained by appeal to the dryness of H2O molecules, and by parity reason, you could never explain consciousness and cognitive phenomena by appeal to neurons, because individual neurons aren't thinking and aren't conscious themselves. That's the move that you can't make. That's when it becomes a fallacy.
Yeah, it kind of leads to another fallacy called the fallacy of the undistributed middle. That's where you point out two things are similar, therefore those two things are the same. I heard one creationist say that the human body is made up of mostly water, and a watermelon is made up of mostly water. Therefore, they're the same. They're the same thing. That we're just watermelons. And also, I heard another argument where it said science says that the universe had a beginning, and Genesis says the universe had a beginning. Therefore, the Genesis account corresponds to science, that they match. And
in exactly one way.
Yeah. The typical way to show the fallacy is to say all students wear backpacks. My uncle wears a backpack, therefore my uncle is a student. They share backpacks in common, but that's it. And,
I move, the universe moves, I am the universe.
Yeah. Another argument is the fallacy of the excluded middle, which is it's another name
fallacy.
It's the false dichotomy or false dilemma. It's either one or the other. A common example is the false trilemma of C.S. Lewis, where he says either Jesus is a lunatic, liar, or Lord. So he's giving only three possibilities. You have to choose between the three. We're ignoring the fourth possibility, where he's simply a legend.
And the possible fifth, sixth, and seventh.
Yeah.
Right. And is that it's not a true dichotomy would be he was either a liar or not a liar. He was either a Lord or not Lord. But to just come up with what might feel intuitively like exhaustive options and then forcing people to choose. I guess since Floyd brought it up, the Lewis trilemma, the problem with it is that it takes for granted that the Bible story is true as written. So if you say Jesus is a historical figure and these words on the page were exactly what was said, then if Jesus says, I'm the Son of God and I'm super awesome, worship me, then take him at his word, right? So if you ignore the idea that this could be fictionalized, if you ignore the idea that Jesus could be some sort of legendary, mythical, composite character that came together over, decades or hundreds of years, and Lewis doesn't consider that, right? He doesn't, for obvious reasons, he doesn't consider that.
Right.
This is another one that's not necessarily fallacious, though, because if you're both granting certain underlying assumptions, it's like C.S. Lewis, he may not have been giving an exhaustive list precisely because he's writing to an audience that would have granted him the assumption that Jesus is some guy who existed and there are stories about him and all that stuff. So, if you both grant certain assumptions, an exhaustive list can be a non-true dichotomy. You don't have to always have this A or not A. You can give, like, was that car red or orange? I don't know. Maybe it was somewhere in between, because you're asking someone something because it was close to a color, or some other example, but
like you hit it. You hit it if you grant it. If I were to grant it or accept that as the dichotomy or the trichotomy, then we can move from there.
Yeah.
If I don't accept it, then if someone were to bring it up to like Floyd now, he wouldn't accept it because he has legend on there, and they would have to accept legend from him to move on from there as being part of the equation. I'm starting to understand some of this.
I think actually one of the fallacies that I want to touch on as well is special pleading, because that's one that's brought up a lot, and I think it's brought up inaccurately sometimes. I think sometimes it is brought up properly. It's just thrown to the side. That when you have to invent the reasons as needed in order to explain aspects of evidence. One of the things I hear a lot, and want to just to make sure that this is special pleading, is the entire idea of Romans 1:20. We all know God exists because Romans 1:20. It seems like special pleading because you're already pleading to the fact that God has to exist in order to get to the stage where you have to validate the logic of the Bible in the first place to come to the conclusion that everybody knows that God exists.
I think that's actually begging the question.
Yeah, that's
basically
begging the question.
What you're doing is you're assuming that your conclusion is true, that the Bible is an authoritative document. You're assuming the conclusion is true, that God exists and that the Bible is true, and in an argument against someone on whether or not the Bible is true and that God exists, or that they believe in God. So you're just giving them, you're assuming true your conclusion, basically, and so that's begging the question. So like a lot of people misunderstand that one as because there's a common phrase we use that's like, this begs the question this, or this raises the question that, when it's not actually the fallacy. Like, those are two terms that have nothing to do with one another.
Right.
Yeah, begging the question basically means you have assumed something that is an implication, or you've assumed your conclusion directly in an argument against someone about that very conclusion.
Yeah, there's something I'd like to say about that. Aaron's exactly right on that. We use the expression begging the question in two senses, and it's funny because the expression begging the question is sort of a shortened form of the expression to beggar the question, or beggaring the question. You're literally begging. What you're saying is just begging the other person to ask a question of you. Let me give you an example of this. Supposing you say, how is vision possible, Ozzy? And I say, well, here's how vision works. There's a little man inside my head, and he's looking out through my eyeballs. That's how vision works. Well, that beggars the question, how the hell does that little man inside your head, Ozzy, how does he see? Oh, there's a little man inside of his head looking out through his eyeballs, right? And so, well, again, that beggars the same question, right? So that's an example of beggaring the question, where what you have said, you know that as soon as that explanation or that answer comes out of your mouth, it's practically like you're on your knees saying, please ask me the question again, right? Or ask me this new question, right? So to beggar the question just means you're giving an answer, you're giving a reply that you know is going to immediately, or you should know, is going to elicit another question or the same question all over again.
That's a good example of an infinite regress, what you were doing, too.
Yeah, that would be an infinite logical regress there. But the fallacy of begging the question is what Aaron said, and that is when a person illicitly or perhaps explicitly, knowingly, assumes their conclusion. That is, the thing that's at issue, the bone of contention, the conclusion they're supposed to be working towards proving or establishing or arguing for, is being smuggled in as a premise in their argument. And if I could, there's something I'd like to say about this that's important because people go on and on about circular reasoning, and that's what begging the question is in this sense. When a person is committing that fallacy of begging the question where they assume their conclusion, they're arguing in a circle. And in the great debate, there's a lot of talk about circular reasoning and specifically something called a viciously circular argument versus a virtually circular argument.
Oh, God.
And this, I have to sort of bring this up because this idea of a circular argument that is virtuous is an imbecility. It is absolutely stupid.
I agree.
You can take any logic course you want. You can take any course on critical thinking that you want. Yes, it's true that a person can start with a premise and then and that premise be undefended. They can use it as an axiom or a properly basic belief or something like that and build on that. But that's not a circular argument. And the fact that they can't defend a premise or an axiom doesn't make an argument circular. An argument is only circular when you try to defend your premise by assuming it,
Right.
or try to defend your conclusion by assuming it. Right? So it helps here to understand what's wrong with circular reasoning. Okay, so that you can understand why there's no such thing as a virtuously circular argument, why they're all viciously circular. Okay, a circular argument is one in which, as I said, one has smuggled in one's very conclusion into the premise of the argument towards which you're supposed to be arguing. And that means that the argument is reducible to this logical form. A, therefore A. All right? A, therefore A. Now, that logical form of argument has a name in logic. Okay? It's called iteration. You're just repeating your conclusion. Okay? It's the name of an inference rule. It's actually valid. Right? In logic, when you're deriving proofs, when you're doing something called natural deduction, when you're actually working out a logical proof, you can at any point take any premise that you've got or any sub-conclusion or any lemma that you've derived from it, and you can always take it and bring it down the proof and write it out again. You can iterate it and reiterate it again and again. It's a given. You're taking it as a given. Okay, that's called iteration. You're allowed to argue logically A, therefore A, because if A is true, A is true. A, therefore A is absolutely valid. You cannot deny it. Okay? But it's a trivial rule of logic, and it obviates. Yeah. It's vacuous. It's a trivial rule, and it obviates the need for any other premises or inference rules towards that conclusion. If you have an argument with multiple premises, and you're trying to get to the conclusion A, and one of your premises is A, everything else in the argument is junk. Everything else is a fifth wheel. It's irrelevant. You can always go A, therefore A. You don't need A and B and C and D, therefore A. You just need A, therefore A. The B, C, D, and E, and everything else is just redundant.
Right.
Okay, and so A, therefore A is always true. Anything can be A. God exists, therefore God exists. God doesn't exist, therefore God doesn't exist. A, therefore A is an argument that is formally valid for any proposition.
Right.
It's formally valid for every proposition, including its opposite. So if you think it's virtuously circular to argue A, therefore A, what you don't realize is that you have just said that whatever premise I take to be true and can infer a conclusion from that, your opponent can do the same with the opposite of your proposition. They can say, not A, therefore not A. That too is absolutely valid. It's a trivial iteration. And that's why we say that although it's technically valid, it's vacuous. It doesn't give you anything. This is an inference rule, circular reasoning. This is a form of argument that supports not just any proposition, it supports every proposition, including its negation. And that's why it's junk. That's why we say it's viciously circular. And that's why no circular argument can ever be virtuous.
Right.
Right? It's an imbecility to.
No, I'm glad you laid that out. You laid that out really clear. Because that's I don't accept the virtuously circular, but I've never had a clear argument to go against.
That kind of leads to what Christopher Hitchens said, where Christopher Hitchens says that which can be asserted without evidence can be rejected without evidence. Now, some people claim that's self-refuting, but I don't think it is, because you can apply that same standard to that statement itself. I don't see it as self-refuting. I've heard Thea say that is self-refuting, but I don't think it is.
It's not self-refuting. It's merely an assertion. But yeah, it doesn't defeat itself unless you are the person who rejects it. I mean, someone can give you something without evidence, and you can take it.
Right. If I could just, in the side chat, Shannon raised an important point. She gave the example of everything is natural, therefore everything is natural. This is a form of circular reasoning that I hear people, atheists, people in our camp here, make this mistake all the time. They're arguing with someone who believes in the supernatural, and they're arguing against supernaturalism. They're arguing from naturalism against supernaturalism, and they'll say, no, everything that exists is natural. No, that's your conclusion. You can't use that as a premise. You can't say the supernatural can't exist because there's only the natural. You can't say all of reality is exhausted by the natural, right? You can try to argue for that, but you can't use that as a premise. And you'll hear people say, well, no, because no matter what we discovered, if we discovered something new and weird and wonderful, it would just become part of the natural. We would just be subsumed under the heading of natural.
Yeah.
That's what's at issue, you dummy. You can't use that as a premise. It's your conclusion, right? And that is a terrible argument. But I hear that argument used again and again, because what they'll do is they'll say, look at everything we've ever found. All we've ever found is natural. Have you ever talked to a supernaturalist? They'll point to things that they say, no, some of those things you think are natural are in fact supernatural. Yep. Some of them will say everything in the universe, because it's God's creation and a result of God's causal powers, everything is in fact supernatural.
Yep.
I have news for you. That's a mirror image of your argument.
Right.
Doesn't this also kind of go into the suppressed evidence?
Yes, it can. Can you elaborate on that? Because there's two ways to go on that.
Well, if evidence is presented and it's not taken seriously, or it's not given the same standard that other things are given, right? Just almost being ignored, relevant evidence. That's suppressed evidence. Don't you think it ties into that a little bit?
Yeah, it does. It's a way of dismissing evidence. Like if, for instance, if a person says, I'm a naturalist and I don't believe in the supernatural, and along comes a person and says, well, hang on, consider this. Here's a report of a miracle. What do you think of this? And they go, oh, there can't be miracles, and therefore, no, these stories of miraculous healings and answered prayers, they have to be false. That's suppressing the evidence. That's dismissing the evidence. That's just sort of hocus pocus, poof, the evidence, the counter evidence goes away. No, you have to actually deal with the evidence. You can't just say, oh, there can't be such evidence. There can't be any contrary facts to my position. No, you have to actually deal with them, and you can't do that. And people do suppress evidence all the time that way.
Unless you don't want to have a rational conversation. If you don't, then
something that's really interesting to me is I thought for sure in this conversation that the biases would come up, because a lot of the fallacies are kind of born from biases, don't you think?
Can you give me an example?
Appeal to emotion.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Appeal to emotion.
I meant to have an actual argument that someone uses that would. That's how I'm learning from this.
Well, to say there's no such thing as miracles, apologists will say, well, you have an anti-supernatural bias.
Right, and that's an inherent thing you can't avoid, and I can't blame anyone for doing it. If you're a New Testament scholar and you're looking at the book of Matthew and you go to chapter 24 and you see here's a prediction of the destruction of the temple. This must be written after AD 70. This is evidence that it was written after AD 70 because Jesus couldn't possibly have actually prophesied that this was going to happen in around 30. Therefore, that's why we date the gospel at so close to 70, precisely for that reason. And I don't blame anyone for doing it, and I'm not saying you should, because I accept any historian, any scholar should be on some type of methodological naturalism. I'm perfectly fine with that. The problem is it's an inherent bias. It is an inherent assumption that can't be avoided. You're either going to stake, you're going to plant your flag on one side of this fence, no matter what position you take.
Yeah, because you'd have the bias on the other side as well, saying these are supernatural.
Right.
Yeah.
It was a prophecy, therefore it must be written
Yeah.
before. Or you could leave it open and say I'm open to either one of these things being true, but I can't really date the gospel based on this particular thing. So first century sometime.
That's what G-Man does with the date of the Earth, and that's one position that I like that he holds is that he doesn't put a date on the Earth. He said that I can't get that from the Bible, or I don't get that from it, so I'm not going to put a date on it.
Can I add something to what was said about the vicious and virtuous circles? That language is being borrowed from, it's used in the social sciences, so I mean, if applied to something like psychology or economics, it makes perfect sense, right? So if you talk about, for example, you go into a region and you infuse a bunch of money, you build a factory or something, and more jobs, more money, people are prosperous, people are spending more money, more employment, more jobs, more spending, more employment, more jobs, more spending, virtuous circle, right? Or something like the
Positive
economy, something like in Detroit, it's a vicious circle when things are going in the opposite direction, and you can describe clearly what is the virtue and the vice that's being talked about. It's clear what we're talking about when we talk about somebody who's forms good habits, and they learn to eat well and exercise, and it's this virtuous circle, positive behaviors that get you a desired result, versus a vicious circle being something like a drug addiction downward spiral. It's sort of this negative or positive feedback loop, that these behaviors lead to more behaviors of the same type, and it ultimately is destructive for a person. So those are the contexts in which virtuous or vicious circles make sense. They're not used in logic. I've never seen it. Maybe Ozzy is. He just said it doesn't exist, so I'm going to trust him. That's my non-valid appeal to authority for the day, or maybe valid. I don't know.
That's fallacy.
I did have.
Everything's wrong. That's fallacy.
Is it a fallacy to ask your authority whether you can appeal to him or not?
But
it's question begging.
Please answer my question. There's my question begging. My question is this. This is my, I think, last question for the day. I probably have to take off after this. It's been fun, by the way. It's been a great hangout.
Yeah, I'm glad you've
I was going to ask, one thing is reification we haven't mentioned, and I think it's an interesting fallacy, and also sort of the difference between a category error versus reify something. So, Ozzy, I don't know if you got, or Floyd, I mean, you guys both seem pretty well informed as far as fallacies, but I was hoping to pick your brains a little bit about this one. Like, how to identify a reification error versus category error? Maybe that's, or how to differentiate the two. Thank you.
Okay. Floyd, did you have something? Go ahead. No? Okay. I heard someone. I thought it was Floyd.
It was almost me. But
oh, no, Aaron, I'm sorry. You go ahead. I've had plenty of airtime. You go ahead.
Yeah, I was on reification, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding is the reification is basically when you take some abstract concept, such as nothing, as a good example, and you make that into something like an object, and make that something you can use, or something that behaves like some other type of object. If you're saying something,
show me a bucket of the number 2.
Yeah, something came into my heart. That is, in a way, is a reification. It's a metaphor, of course. There's no actual thing entering your heart when something comes into your heart in the same way. Nothing doing something is another type of reification, where you're taking a concept that is not something that behaves like an object, because nothing can't behave in any way at all. It can't do anything. But because we have because language works the way it is, you can use a noun and put a verb there, and nothing is doing something because there's a subject and a predicate in your sentence. But it doesn't mean nothing can actually behave or love can actually do things. So that's one example of reification. Category error. One place it is used is to try to look for something. This is one that I think atheists do a lot, where they say, where is your peer-reviewed paper for the existence of God, or where is your empirical evidence that God exists, or something like that, or some transcendent supernatural thing. You can't. That is a category error unless you have an example where the supernatural is said to impact something that should actually be measurable or sensible or something like that. So if you don't have any reason to think that there's a temperature increase or how much does a soul weigh, that's a category error.
Right. That's a good
as
one.
opposed to a reification.
Yeah, that's a really good example. I hear atheists make that mistake all the time. Actually, they'll say, not not about a peer-reviewed article or something, but they'll say something like, show me God. I want to see God. And well, it depends who you're talking about, who you're talking to. If you're talking to someone who believes in Zeus, well, okay, that the question at least makes sense. Well, we can charge up to Mount Olympus and maybe we'll see him. Because Zeus is that kind of god. Okay, but if a person says, I believe in, the God of the philosophers, I believe in, a God that is transcendent, stands outside of time and space, and is the ground of all being. Okay, admittedly that's a little vague, but nevertheless, they are not positing a God that is an object to be met with in space.
Right.
And if you are insisting that they provide empirical evidence to our senses in time and space in this world of something that they say is not the kind of thing that could exist in this world, time and space, then you're confused, right? It's a category error. You really are quite confused. You are asking them to give you evidence of something which, if they provided that evidence, wouldn't be evidence of the thing that they're talking about.
Right.
It's like asking for a crocoduck.
Yep. You have to ask
sorry,
them
evolution doesn't predict crocoducks, so when people ask for a crocoduck, they're nuts. They're completely ignorant. They don't understand the theory. That's not a category error, but I mean it's the same kind of mistake there, where you're asking the person to provide something that
Tommy Hall makes
is inappropriate.
I didn't mean to mention by name, but he wants evidence for evolution by something adding an anatomical feature to it.
Yeah, another one that happens with category errors, it has to do with the existence of things in general. People don't understand that the word existence doesn't only refer to a certain kind of thing. Like, there are some people who will define existence very, very narrowly as an object to be met with in space. So that things like hammers and people and eyeglasses, those exist. But if you say, the number 6. Or the thought of a unicorn, they'll say, "Oh no, those are just concepts." Well, yeah, but don't concepts exist? No, they don't exist. Concepts don't exist. Stop talking about concepts then. Stop using concepts while you're at it. Stop using these non-existent things, right? No. The word existence is a word that has different uses. It's used to describe different categories of existing things. There are different ways in which things exist, right? Do interest rates exist? Well, an interest rate is not an object to be met with in space, right? But it's an economic fact, okay? And people will do the same thing with moral facts. If you're a moral realist, you believe in moral facts. Now, you might not believe in moral facts, but what you can't do is say, there can't be moral facts because a moral fact is not an object to be met with in space. Neither is a number.
Right.
Neither is the concept of a unicorn. Neither is an interest rate.
Well,
do we have to stop talking about these things?
Well, the other, I mean, because it's boiled down to tautology at that point in time. That when you break everything down into either concepts or objects, and if the only thing that meets the criteria to exist is an object, basically what you're saying at that point in time is objects exist because they're objects.
Yes, that's right. And you have, what you've done is you've constrained the meaning of the word object and the meaning of the word existing. Artificially. There's absolutely no reason to do that. No one gets to dictate how the language is used that way, and that isn't a more rigorous use of language. That's a use of language that is Procrustean. It's arbitrary, just cutting things off.
Right, you're defining things out of existence.
You're defining things out of existence, and you are. It betrays a kind of ignorance of the subtleties and nuances of how language actually works.
Right. Let me add something real quick before we go too far off.
Just before you do Xbox, I just want to let anybody watching know that we're going to be opening up the room in a few minutes for anybody else who wants to come in and add something to the discussion here. And Xbox is going to say something. Then I think Shannon wanted to touch on something as well.
Yeah, mine's real quick. It was just to address when someone's asking for the existence of God, when you're saying that if it's something that's outside of time and space, you can't ask that's category error. You've got to come and ask more of how the person you're talking to came to know that there's a God. You can't ask them for the actual physical evidence of it. I just wanted to address that for anybody that actually uses that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Maybe they can start using that question instead.
Yeah, that's probably a better way to do it.
Yeah, that was it, Shannon. You go ahead.
Yeah, just to get back to special pleading, I don't think we ever actually described what special pleading is. An example of special pleading is the claim, like, for example, the miracles of the Bible are true, but the miracles of other religions are false. That's special pleading. You're giving a special status to one literary or religious text, while not giving the same standard to other ones.
Yeah, it's like a fallacy of a double standard, where you hold
Right.
one to a kind of low standard, and then everything else is, oh, you have to show me this, you have to show me this. It's like a young Earth creationist one, where they'll accept certain claims in Genesis, but simply because Genesis says it. But if a scientist says it, or if a million scientists said it, oh, I'm kind of skeptical. You guys aren't you guys have too much faith because you believe in this evolution just because man is saying it. When you got one chapter in one book telling you the Earth was created in 6 days, and then you got a double standard of special pleading.
Yeah. Can Shanna jump in there real quick? She was trying. I don't think Floyd heard me a second ago. I was trying to. If you wanted to add something real quick.
Oh, no, that was okay. Oz said something about the
Confirmation bias, and I believe it was.
Yeah, it was a question I had. You mentioned in the side chat something, an expression that I wasn't familiar with. It was choice supportive bias or something like that.
choice supportive bias. Yes. That's when we have a tendency to look back at our choices that we've made and hold them kind of in a higher regard than what they really were. Think that we did a better job than we actually did. We're really bad at that.
That's a good point. Yes.
Yeah. Well, like I said before, I think a lot of fallacies are born from biases. And then we have the blind spot bias, where we think we don't have biases. We think we're immune to them in some way. I really think the fallacies are born from these biases. There's lots of them.
Fundamental attribution error is a really good one.
Yeah, that's a huge one.
That's a huge one.
What's that?
Yeah. Well, Shannon knows an awful lot about that. I'll let her speak.
The fundamental attribution error. It's where we have the tendency to, when other people make a mistake, we fail to see all of the circumstances that could have led them to that mistake. But when we make a mistake, we're really good at pointing out, hey, no, this, and this happened, which made me think this, which made me do this. We're extremely good at saying it when we do it, but not when other people do it. That's the fundamental attribution error. We attribute the wrong things at the wrong times.
Yeah.
Really bad.
This expresses itself very, very obviously in the Great Debate, where a person will say, I came by my faith, or I came by my lack of faith, by reasoning. When I was a theist, I used terrible reasoning, but now that I'm an atheist, I'm enlightened, and I got to my atheism through just the most wonderful reasoning, right? So we attribute our present position, whatever it is, to good reasons and good evidence. We were being rational. That's how we got to where we are.
Which is also part of that choice supportive bias.
Right. Whereas the other people out there, no, they have motivations and causes. They don't have reasons. They have motivations and causes of their position. That's what motivates a person to believe the opposite of what I believe. But what I believe, oh no, I got there through good reasoning, and we're all guilty of that. That's sort of, it's just how we think, and it helps to sort of be aware of this fundamental attribution error where we credit ourselves with having arrived at our positions by virtue of good reasoning, and we assign reasons and not reasons, but motivations and causes for why other people arrive at their beliefs. And we'll even do it for people who share our beliefs. We'll think that, that other atheist over there, he's not an atheist for the right reasons, but me, I'm an atheist for the right reason, or he's a theist for the wrong reasons, but I'm a theist for the right reasons. So that's fundamental attribution error, as we find it in the Great Debate. We see that everywhere, I find.
Yeah, that one reminds me of I think one, unless y'all talked about it before I got in, but the two quoque fallacy, where instead of having like a double standard over yourself and having a different view of other people, what you'll do is you'll see someone else do something, and you'll justify your own actions or beliefs based on the fact that the other person is doing it too. And so you'll see this a lot in politics, where you'll see some national leader say, I'm just doing what the other party did 4 years ago while they were in power. I don't know why you guys are complaining. And then they'll use that as a justification for their action, like a giant budget or a war or something. And they'll say, I'm just doing what you guys did. And then when the other people get in power, we're just doing what you guys did. And you always have this endless cycle of being able to prove that the other side is a hypocrite. Instead of actually justifying your actions, what you're doing is you're actually proving that the other person is a hypocrite when he criticizes you for it. So you don't actually have to justify anything.
Yeah, that's what the tu quoque fallacy is. Oh, and for those who, it's pronounced tu quoque, and it just means you too, and it's the appeal to hypocrisy. A person accuses you of something or describes, criticizes or raises an objection to your position, and you say, oh yeah, well you do that too, and it's a species of ad hominem, by the way. This is another, these, as I said earlier, these fallacies sometimes cluster together, and some of them go together because some of them are subspecies of the other. So the tu quoque fallacy is actually a species of ad hominem. What you're trying to do is by saying something about the other person, you're trying to, in an ad hominem way, you're trying to discredit them. So it's just an appeal to hypocrisy. So your doctor says, you really should quit smoking, and he gives you all these wonderful reasons for quitting smoking, and they all make perfect sense. But he's smoking while he's telling you this, right? And so you say, oh well, geez, you're smoking, I don't have to pay any attention to that. Well, no, yeah, you should listen to the reasons. You shouldn't look at anything about the person. But the fact that the guy is smoking is irrelevant. His reasoning might be impeccable, and so the fact that the person is smoking is irrelevant. So that fact about the person is irrelevant. It's an ad hominem, and specifically, it's a tu quoque. It's an appeal to hypocrisy. And actually, this finds its way, interestingly enough, in the Great Debate with presuppositionalism, because sometimes a presuppositionalist will say, on your worldview as an atheist or an unbeliever, you can't make sense of such and such, and then you can't explain such and such, and then I would come along and I would say, really? Okay, yeah, I'll grant I don't have a justification for this, but you don't either, and they'll say, oh, that's tu quoque. Well, it would be tu quoque if I was trying to defend my position by appealing to the fact that they can't defend it. But I'm not trying to defend my position. When I say we have properly basic beliefs, or we have starting assumptions, and from which we simply cannot avoid, we have to start somewhere, I'm not saying that they are defensible. I'm granting their indefensibility. But I can also point out, you, by the way, are in the same boat. That's not tu quoque. It would only be tu quoque if I said, my position is defensible because you're in the same boat, and if your position is defensible, then mine is defensible. No, the argument is they're both indefensible. We're both starting from assumptions that cannot be defended, and so then it's not tu quoque. It would only be tu quoque if I tried to exculpate myself or absolve myself and claim that I wasn't that I had a defensible position by appealing to them being in the same position. That would be a problem. That would be tu quoque.
Well, I hear it. Tell me how it's with the how the presuppositionalist would use it, like the Psi or Arcane or one of them would use it whenever, if I brought up, well, how do you defend against Islam? or the invisible pink unicorn, and they're like, well, you don't believe in that, so I don't have to argue it.
Well, that wouldn't be too quoque.
Right. I didn't
But
think
that's a fallacy of irrelevance, though, because what you're doing is you're trying to show that you're arguing by what's called parity of reasoning. You're showing, look, if the argument that you're presenting over here actually would support this position over here, which I don't uphold, neither do you. But if it's going to uphold your position, it'll also uphold the pink unicorn or whatever it is, or the flying spaghetti monster.
I'm saying if I hold it, like if I said I hold the invisible pink unicorn and use the same argument just for this argument. If I hold that position just for this argument, but I don't in reality hold that position, that's not too quoque, right?
No, it's
okay,
perfectly okay.
That's what I've got called out on before for it.
Yeah, that's not too quoque. That's arguendo. You're arguing within the scope of a certain assumption. That's perfectly legitimate.
Okay, that's what I thought. I'm not too clear. I'm learning more on the fallacies tonight then.
Yeah. Would you call that a reductio?
Well, it could be a reductio ad absurdum argument. It depends.
Yeah, that was where it was going, but it never.
Oh, you're trying to reduce the other person's position to absurdity?
Right.
Oh, yeah. Okay, then that's a reductio. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I want to.
But you never get there because they call out too quoque.
I want to welcome John of Dropouts, Simon, DPR, and Armin to the room. Have you guys been watching it all?
No, I didn't even know what was going on.
Yeah, every Friday at 8 Eastern.
And, well, for the people that maybe were kind of following along with the conversation, we're talking about just logical fallacies here. Does anybody else have anything that they want to present to the panel or any questions that they want to ask?
I have been following along, but I don't have any questions because everything seemed above my pay grade.
All right, how would you, John? I probably went AFK.
He almost spoke.
Yeah, sure. Well, in the meantime, actually, there, I think he was muted. John, do you have something to say?
I can bring up more fallacies if.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, I have more too. So.
One related to special pleading is the ad hoc fallacy. And ad hoc fallacy is when you bring up an after-the-fact explanation or a contrived explanation. And that's used a lot. I see it's used a lot when trying to harmonize contradictions, for example. You bring up contradiction in the Bible, they say, oh, well, if this happened and this happened, what if this happened, then it could be harmonized. Well, what evidence do you have that those things actually happened? Yeah, you don't. They're just contrived. They're just after a fact, a what-if scenario to get you out of any jam that you want. So that's ad hoc.
Yeah, you find a lot of ad hoc in bad scientific theories, where instead of saying this is a defeater, they'll add they might add qualifications to their theory. So now you have this long list of rules that every Tuesday something happens. So I can't do tests on Tuesday because when I did a test on Tuesday, it would have disproven it. Therefore, I can't do things on Tuesday, and because it would disprove the theory. So you have an extra qualification on it, and then you try it again on Wednesday and say, okay, so it's every Tuesday and every Wednesday that this doesn't work, but every other time it works. And so it's for this purpose. It's ad hoc.
It's an escape hatch.
Yeah.
My router has an ad hoc option. I actually think it's a similar thing. I think so. It's labeled ad hoc. It's so that you can set settings like you were just saying. You can put all the qualifiers on it.
There's another. It's not so much a fallacy as well. I mean, there's fallacious reasoning involved, but there's a distinction that needs to be made that people fail to distinguish, and it causes a lot of problems. And that's the distinction between necessary and sufficient conditions. People sort of get into all kinds of trouble in arguments where they confuse necessary and sufficient conditions. What do I mean by that? Well, a necessary condition is a condition necessary for something to be true. And a sufficient condition is merely what suffices for something to be true, but isn't necessary. So let me give you an example. Let's imagine that you say, what's necessary for you to get an A in this course? Let's say you're taking a college course in mathematics or something, or English or something like that, an English course. And what is necessary to get an A? Well, what's necessary minimally is you have to be registered in the course, you have to attend the class, you have to take the tests, you have to submit your papers. All of those are going to be necessary. If you don't hand in the papers, if you're not registered for the course, if you don't do the homework, and if you don't take the tests, you're not going to get an A in the class, right? Those things are all necessary, but no one of them is sufficient, right? Well, what would be sufficient to get an A in the class? What would be sufficient would be that you get an A in every single assignment. If you get an A in every single assignment, then that suffices to get an A in the class. Okay, and so it's important to distinguish between necessary and sufficient, because sometimes people will point to something that's sufficient and think that it's necessary. I'll give you an example. Often in the Great Debate, people have discussions and disagreements about the nature of the mind, and is the mind physical or is the mind immaterial? And a lot of atheists tend to be materialists or physicalists and insist that brains cause minds, and that brains are necessary for the mind to exist. And theists will often say, no, it's not necessary, that the mind could be immaterial. Now, a mistake that a lot of people make is they point to the fact that, well, wherever we find a mind in the world, we typically find a brain. Everywhere where we can decisively establish that there is a mind, we can also decisively point to there being some brain there. So we conclude that there's some intimate connection between brains and minds. But some people think what they should be concluding is that, well, it would appear that brains, at least some brains sufficiently organized, are sufficient to produce a mental life and mental effects, mental phenomena, minds. But people will go beyond that and say brains are necessary. Oh, well, wait a minute. To say that they're necessary is to say that brains and only brains could produce a mind. Well, how do you argue that? That's a little bit harder. More needs to be done there because you haven't ruled out anything else. So there's a lot of what goes on in question begging. A lot of the question begging that we find in the Great Debate is actually a result of people confusing a sufficient condition for a necessary condition. And there's another one that troubles me a lot, and that's sort of the whole definition of atheism. You'll hear a lot of atheists defining atheism as a lack of a belief in a God. It's not a belief. It's not a position. It's not the belief that there are no gods. It's merely lacking a belief that there are gods. But what you're doing there is you're looking only at a necessary condition. It's necessary, if you're an atheist, to be an atheist, it's necessary that you lack a belief in God. Because if you didn't lack a belief in God, it would mean you had a belief in God. And if you had a belief in God, you wouldn't be an atheist. So it's necessary to being an atheist that you lack a belief in God. But is that sufficient? Is that enough? And traditionally, the way atheism has been understood and defined is that atheism is the belief that there are no gods. In fact, if you talk to almost anybody on YouTube or on Google Plus who self-identifies as an atheist, and you'll find that they don't just lack a belief in God, they actually think that no gods exist. They don't merely lack a belief in God. They don't just satisfy the necessary condition. There's an additional sufficiency condition that they satisfy. And so this whole lacktheism definition of atheism, as I call it, is a case where people are putting forward a necessary condition and insisting that that necessary condition is also sufficient for being an atheist. And that, I think, is a mistake, and people can disagree with me on that. But the point is, the difference there is one person thinks that it's necessary, and the other person thinks it's both necessary and sufficient, and that's where the argument is.
Sorry.
Or who decides what's sufficient? Would I decide, like, if I said the word atheist, I would decide on the sufficiency for me of what that means?
No, because words are public. We don't own them. No individual owns them, right? I mean, our words, our language, they belong to us. They belong to us the way a municipal park belongs to us. You know, I can't just go and decide build up my house in a municipal park, right? It's communal. We all own it, and the meaning of it can shift and vary. So there can be a semantic shift, so that over time people can just start talking differently and using words differently, and the definition of a word can shift and change. It absolutely can evolve. But the point is, at any given time, how is the word to be used? And in that case, well, really, you can't just say I'm defining it this way. I mean, you can do that, but you have to understand that the next time you open your mouth and you don't expressly define how you mean it, you are in fact using a word at odds with how other people are using it.
Right.
So it's not a question of who decides, right? Who decides that, you know, the word "to," the numeral 2, is going to be spelled TWO? Who decides that? Well, nobody decided it. It's a convention, and we're just accepting it, and that's what we go with. That's the meanings of our words are determined by how we use them. Right?
So
words don't have meaning; they have a usage. They have an application.
So if it didn't meet the sufficiency of my stance, then I don't hold that stance. Or that label, anyway.
Well, I mean, you just have to ask yourself.
Sure.
How is the word in fact used? Forget what definitions are out there, because definitions are just sort of like dictionary definitions are really just our best attempt to capture how the word tends to be used in most contexts, right? And so they're rough and ready approximations, right? So all you have to do is sort of be sensitive to how the word is used in various contexts and ask yourself, given how it's applied, does that word apply to me? Right? And forget about how I would define it. You don't have to worry about how you would define it, right? People.
I run into that problem with atheism, though. Like, if it's not sufficient to say I just lack the belief in God, like you were saying, that definition isn't sufficient, but I still, under that criteria, fall under that label.
Right, but it's because it's necessary.
Right, because
it's necessary. Yes, that's right. In my view, it is necessary to be an atheist that you lack a belief in God.
Right.
Because if you had a belief in God, you wouldn't be an atheist; you'd be a theist.
Right. So does it have to meet both those, like you said? Does it have to be necessary and sufficient?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, absolutely. That for something to be necessary and sufficient is to specify all and only the conditions, right?
Yeah.
So I brought it up before in regards to like the Klum argument there, that one of the things I brought up there was I thought of as an equivocation between saying that you know, the universe begins to exist, and you know, everything in the universe begins to exist. But that would be an example of something that's that would actually might be sufficient but not necessary, or might be necessary but not sufficient.
I'm sorry, I didn't follow there. I was reading something in the side chat. I don't know if you were asking me or not, and I didn't hear it. I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem. Okay, but when someone says that the universe, okay, so in the Klum argument, when someone that says that everything in the universe, or everything that exists, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe is a cause. Because the I'm trying to see how that relates to the sufficient and the necessary in that argument, because I feel like it does somehow in the statement that the universe has a cause, or that it's necessary that it has a cause.
It's in the beginning part.
Yeah,
It's actually in the.
I guess a cause is necessary for an effect.
They're trying to argue the necessity. That's what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
Right, but
I think
it's not necessary that the universe has a cause outside of the set that the universe is in.
Well, no, but they're arguing as a premise that the universe has a beginning, right? So you have a general premise, a major premise. Everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. The universe had a beginning. Well, if it had a beginning, then it had to have a cause based on the other premise, right?
That's where my issue is.
That's a perfectly valid argument. Now, you can challenge one or the other or both premises. I mean, I would challenge both, in fact. But now, could I address a question that Xbox asked me before, and he's asked it again in the side chat?
Oh, yeah, sorry. I didn't think you saw the other one.
Yeah, no, I did. With the conversation was flowing, and I didn't want to.
No, you're fine. Yeah.
Okay. What you asked is, can you bring up the use of fallacies as weapons? Yeah, I sort of alluded to that at the very, very beginning. There are two ways that you can use fallacies as a weapon. You can use fallacy, like you can deliberately use bad reasoning. Okay, I mean, think of like appeals to emotion and ad baculum, appeal to adverse consequences and stuff like that. I mean, those are weapons. Those are ways of levering or pressuring a person through the art of persuasion and rhetoric into a conclusion. Okay, so that's using a fallacy as a weapon, and you might be doing it quite deliberately, self-consciously, or you might not even realize that you're doing it, right? Because you fell for it yourself. You might sincerely believe that these arguments are good ones, and so you can be applying a fallacious argument, and but that's not exactly using it as a weapon if you sincerely believe it yourself. So to say that a fallacy can be used as a weapon is to imply that the person knows that it's a fallacious argument and is cynically and opportunistically using what they know to be an illegitimate and invalid argument in order to pressure a person into a position or persuade them through bad reasoning.
Or like something you touched on earlier about saying, oh, that's a fallacy, not telling you a fallacy, but saying that's a fallacy, I'm disregarding your whole argument now. So I went through your whole premise and everything. I found one little thing that I didn't like, so I'm going to throw everything out. Yeah.
There are some people in the great debate who love to do this. They'll get into an argument with someone, and then at some point the person will take a misstep. They'll argue poorly for something. They'll commit a fallacy, and then they'll go, gotcha, you committed a fallacy. And then all that person wants to do is talk about how you committed a fallacy and keep bringing it up and bringing it up and bringing it up. You can have 20 good arguments for your conclusion and one fallacious one, and all they'll focus on is that one, and they won't stop talking about that one. Yeah. And those people who do that, those are bullshit artists. Those are people who are absolutely not interested in the truth. Those people are just trying to discredit you. I have a tendency to avoid people who do that. I mean, when I spot a fallacy in a person's argument, I point out that it's a fallacy, and then say, okay, let's get on with the next argument. Because the fact that you committed a fallacious, fallacy or put forth a fallacious argument doesn't invalidate your conclusion. Right. So that just means, okay, this is not the road to get to where you're going. Let's see if there's another route, and that's how you proceed. That's how any honest interlocutor is going to proceed. They're going to point out a fallacy. They're going to say, you've made a mistake. Hopefully you'll be able to persuade them they made a mistake. But even if you can't, you'll just say, okay, well, listen, we're at loggerheads here. We're at an impasse. I think it's fallacious, so it's not going to persuade me. You don't think it's fallacious, but I'm still not going to be persuaded because I still think it's fallacious, and I've said why I think it's fallacious. So let's just move on. But if you're the type of person who says, you committed a fallacy, and you keep hammering at that, then you are not an honest interlocutor. You're not actually. This is not the disinterested pursuit of truth that's motivating you here. What you're interested in is discrediting the person, and that is the use of fallacies as a weapon. And a lot of people who play name that fallacy, oh, you committed this fallacy, you committed that fallacy, but they don't specify why something is a fallacy, and they don't specify what you said and how it fits that pattern of that fallacy. That's using fallacies as a weapon. And it's really unpleasant. I mean, whenever I point out a fallacy to someone, I always do them the courtesy of explaining why I think they've committed a fallacy. That is what fallacy they've committed and exactly what they said that is an instance of that fallacy, that makes it an instance of that fallacy. And it's what I expect of other people. When they accuse me of a fallacy, I expect them to explain to me how what I said fits the model of the fallacy. And if they can't do it, well, then piss off. They're just playing name that fallacy, and that's a waste of everybody's time. So that's the other way that this goes, that it can be used as a weapon.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much.
I've got another fallacy. Well, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask if I think I have an example of where a fallacy can be used in a discussion to some effect, but are there any that other people use or know or conscious of using?
Oh, go ahead, Simon.
Well, I mean, the one I would say is kind of it's like the opposite argument. So you use the same fallacy back on the person using the opposite terms or presumptions that they use, and then hopefully they will disagree with that point and see the logic of the fallacy that I'm committing.
Yeah, I
done, then reverse it, the not statements to the positive statements, and go, oh yeah, I see, I am committing a fallacy.
Yeah, that's arguing by parity of reasoning. What you do is you use their reasoning back at them, but you use their reasoning to some other conclusion that you know that they wouldn't agree with, and they go, oh wait a minute, you're right, that reasoning doesn't get you there. Oh, there must be something wrong with this reasoning, because this reasoning, this pattern of reasoning, this pattern of argument, doesn't necessarily get you to the truth. And so if you can take a fallacious argument that they presented and apply that same reasoning to some conclusion that they would deny, and then you could say, well, there you go. See, how come you're using this argument for a conclusion you like, but you're not using it for a conclusion you don't like? Clearly, there's something wrong. There's something fishy with this form of argument. It doesn't necessarily lead to a true conclusion. That's what makes it fallacious.
I hate to admit it, but that's a test that sometimes I'll use if I think someone's trying to be intellectually dishonest through our argument. And if they get to that point and then completely ignore it, or you can tell that they see it but they're not going to agree with it, and then that's the end of the argument or end of the discussion with me.
Well, you know what? No, I don't think I'd agree with this. One of the reasons people don't like the pink unicorn and the spaghetti monster nonsense is because the pink unicorn doesn't have the same traits as the God that they're positing, unless you just assign them there, right? But these people are trying to argue to, you know, they're using inferences to get to the traits of this God, because they know what intelligent beings are like. They have an experience with intelligent beings. And then when you just slap in a pink unicorn there, well, do you have experience with pink unicorns being intelligent or intelligently designing anything?
Yeah, no, I don't use that argument, but I do see people using exactly how you're saying it. I don't use any of the pink unicorn or spaghetti monster kind of thing.
Yeah, there's a good way to do it and a bad way to do it, depending on how you do it. It's almost like it's actually a really effective style of argument where you just, okay, I'm going to use your exact reasoning. I'm going to go through the same line of reasoning that you did, but I'm going to apply it in a different area. And then because they wouldn't accept it there, but they do accept it here, it points out a type of special pleading. It's like, okay, we both agree pink unicorns don't exist, for example, or leprechauns or something like that. And I'll use the same reasoning you got for God, maybe some strange argument of well, just positing argument. I'm going to use the same one. I'm going to use a can of soup, for example, on the answered prayer. I'm going to use a can of soup and say, I'm proving that this can of soup answers prayer because it either says yes, no, or wait, or yes, no, or maybe, or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, maybe or not now.
Yeah, it's actually a really good argument to use if you do it properly. There's improper ways to do it though.
I don't see how.
See, it doesn't have to hold the traits. It doesn't. At that point, the can of soup doesn't have to hold the traits that God does.
Right.
Well,
that's the point of the argument. The point of the soup can analogy and how soup cans can answer prayer is to show that even for something that we know doesn't have any of the traits and doesn't have any prayer granting properties, right? It would still pass the test of the answered prayer argument.
Exactly.
The answered prayer.
Right. I think that the soup can argument. I think that helps demonstrate the statistical likelihood problem. But I don't think that negates a God like the people think the pink unicorn and spaghetti monster arguments do.
It doesn't negate.
I think it does one thing when actually it does something different, right?
It doesn't
shows
disprove
weakness in the statistics problem.
It's just for the prayer thing. For the
we all talk at once. That'd be cool.
Oh, sorry. I might be lying.
It doesn't disprove the.
All at the same time.
Yeah, can't hear anything.
Well,
I was
in your ear.
I was trying to be a little more subtle with it than just using the teapot or unicorn examples. So I mean to say, when you've tried to do your best to explain the specific point they're making, whether it be about evolution or any of the 100 arguments I've heard recently, what I'm trying to do is use their example, okay, their exact example, and just opposite the terms. So they're not having to go to something with different properties or imagine.
Right.
They're actually seeing the opposite argument to them, like Ozzy said earlier, with the A therefore A, and I just point out the not A, therefore not A, in the same argument that they're using.
Yeah,
Right.
it's argument by parity of reasoning. I'm going to use the same pattern of reasoning, but I'm just going to reverse the conclusions and the premises around, right?
Yeah.
And you're going to see that I can still get to the same kind of conclusion, but you're going to find the conclusion unpalatable. Well, that shows that there's something wrong with the form of the argument. Because what you're doing when you're pointing out a fallacy is not pointing out that the conclusion has to be wrong, but that the conclusion might not be right, and that's
Right.
because the argument doesn't get you to where you think it gets you. Right? So you don't have to show, when you point out a fallacy, you're never pointing out that the conclusion is false. You're just pointing out that how they got to their conclusion,
Exactly.
is inadequate. And so all you have to do to show that something's wrong with an argument is show that that form of argument doesn't always get you to the truth.
Yeah.
You don't have to show that it never gets you to the truth. It can get you to the truth 99 times out of 100. But if their argument is that necessarily this conclusion has to be true, all you have to do is be able to show that actually no, that argument doesn't always work. It works some of the time, not all of the time, and that's not good enough. And then because we're talking about formal arguments here, we're not talking about probabilistic inductive arguments. We're talking about a formal argument.
Shannon, I do agree with you on the way you were going with it, with people bringing up this spaghetti monster unicorn to disprove God, showing doing the reductio ad absurdum, using that. And I know exactly the arguments you're talking about that are terrible. So I'm glad you brought it up.
Well, actually, one of the things that Ermine just brought up in the side chat about that these are decent rules for a simple discussion. There always need to be a winner or a loser, and I think that's the idea with these is that there doesn't need to be a winner. You don't need to win here. It's just that when you're trying to construct a logical argument, just to when you're trying to justify a conclusion, you have to construct it in a way that is just logically valid, or else there's really no weight to the conclusion that you come to.
Like discussions and arguments, when you're having these kind of conversations and you're presenting arguments like this, that's philosophy, right? You're doing philosophy. So you're essentially presenting an argument, which is also a discussion. The goal should be to learn, to sharpen your reasoning and your critical thinking skills, and to learn. If your goal is to win or lose, then you must think that you're at some sort of formal debate against an opponent with an audience. That's not the case here. At least it shouldn't be the case. If your goal is to win or lose, your goals are fucked up.
Yep.
It can also be the goal to change someone's mind. If you see someone with fallacious reasoning, and most people who are debating, if you are debating, it kind of implies that one thing you might be trying to do is change someone's mind from a conclusion that they probably shouldn't have, or a way of thinking that is either harmful to them or something that's not preferable for them to have. And so
I see people do that as well, and I can't bring myself to that line to.
Yeah,
I can point out where someone is wrong and then move on, but I can't sit there and point out where they're wrong and harp on it until they believe what I believe, or admit that they're wrong, kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's not just about discussion. It's not just about the arguments. That being able to form a sound logical syllogism can aid in your own beliefs, the way you understand your own points.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess the challenge that I have is my job is never to. I'm a marketer, so I don't play with people's logic because that's not where they make decisions. 90% of the time, it's with their emotions. So I find it hard sometimes using a completely different side of my brain to make something logical when it's just not what I know by experience moves people.
You asked that a few weeks back.
What?
You asked that same thing a few weeks back when me and you were in a hangout. I've thought about it ever since.
Yeah, and it's hard because I think Aaron just mentioned, if the goal is to get them to change their mind, I'm sitting here scratching my head going, oh, I'd never use logic for that. And it may be like 90% of the rest of the population, not the great brains in this room, right? So I'm just trying to figure out how to speak their language.
No, that's actually a good point. With if you're trying to persuade someone, a lot of times it's a million times more effective almost to use their emotions and get them to want their conclusion to be false, rather than show them the flaw in their argument. They're gonna find a million different ways to justify that, and try to find some justification for it. Where if you make someone really want themselves to be wrong, or on the other way, if you want someone to be right, then or if you want them to anyway, you get a point.
I have something to say.
Yeah.
Oh.
I'll just say very quickly, I kind of think of it more like irrationality is a virus, and it's more about trying to keep people on the rational side rather than, and logic is one of the biggest tools for that. So it's more about asking people to use good logic, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I would agree with that. When you're arguing with people and you're trying to use reason, you're not just trying to persuade them. You're trying to persuade them with a view to getting them to believe things for the right reasons. Right? We can all sort of emotionally crowbar one another, either forcefully or very, very subtly and ingeniously, into believing things that we want them to believe. Okay, if you're involved in this in the Great Debate, and what you're all about is just recruiting for Team Atheist, or recruiting for Team Theist, or recruiting for Team Deist, or recruiting for Team Igtheist, or whatever. If that's your aim, then you needn't trouble yourself with good arguments. You can just trouble yourself with appeals to emotion and appeals to adverse consequences and appeals to more fundamental values that a person has. Okay, but I think what's operative here, what we're all assuming here, is that our goal is the disinterested pursuit of truth. We're interested in having beliefs that, in fact, map and mirror reality accurately as we can. And our best critical tools here are rationality, skepticism, scientific values, and above all, sound and valid reasoning. But if a person doesn't share that value, if a person just doesn't care about the truth, if they don't care about the truth because they think they've already got it all sewn up, they've got it in their back pocket, or they just don't care because they're sort of cynical or something like that, and their aims are purely political, well, then you've got a problem, because now you're going to be locked into a discourse with a person who will avail themselves of what's called Kettal logic. Any old argument will do, right? We hate those people because those people are effectively hypocrites and liars, right? When people resort to any old argument will do, they don't respect your intellect, and they don't care that you care about the truth, right? They just want to get you onto their team. And so the whole point of studying critical thinking and learning some logic is precisely so that you learn to disabuse yourself of bad ways of reasoning, because good ways of reasoning will, on average, take you away from error and closer to truth. And if you have not practiced how to identify fallacies and patterns of bad reasoning, you doom yourself to repeating mistakes and never finding yourself out of error. The whole point of fallacy theory, of studying fallacies and knowing what they are, is to disabuse yourself of mistakes, of conclusions, and sometimes, and not just false conclusions, true conclusions that you didn't get at the right way. And that means you don't have a reliable process in your head for getting at the truth. Right? You're just getting there by luck, and that's not a good thing.
You think you can Spock it, like add emotion in with your logic?
No. Well, you can't disabuse yourself of your emotions, right? That's not what you want to do. It's just that you want to calibrate.
No, that's exactly where I'm at, and I'm trying to get them back into my thought process. I've removed myself so far from all these things that I do remove almost all my emotions.
Well, you should be kind of. It's actually a good thing to remove yourself from emotions when you're thinking through something as a line of reasoning. Emotions have no place, in my opinion, in having a correct line of reasoning. You could be a calculator, and you should reach the same conclusion if you're going off of facts and evidence.
Right.
However, emotions are real. They're part of human beings. They have value, just not in reaching conclusions and true beliefs, or what you hold to be true beliefs. They have value in other areas. You know,
Well,
such as like,
on
Big reason you rarely see me get into fights is because of that.
well, on that note, we're going to start winding this down here. So, for the remaining panelists here that are participating in this discussion here, if anybody wants to give any just quick closing remarks, and then we're going to take this offline. I think Xbox will probably be opening up a room on his channel if anybody wants to come in and continue talking about this topic.
Yep. Xbox ass.
But first off, Xbox, you have anything that you want to end off with?
No, I think we could. I think this is a really good. I learned a lot from all this. I talked more than I thought I was going to. I thought I was going to be the dumb person in the room. I still was the dumb person in the room, but I was able to add into it. And no, I appreciate it. And I'm glad y'all.
Ozzy?
Oh, geez, I kind of gave a summary statement. I'll summarize my summary. The whole point of knowing fallacies and studying fallacies is to disabuse yourself of error, to find out, to discover what patterns of reasoning, what patterns of argumentation don't reliably lead to valid and sound conclusions. I mean, the whole point is to be less wrong. And knowing fallacies, not just being able to name fallacies, but identify a fallacy, specify why an argument is fallacious, is a really good skill to acquire. You build these up very slowly, but the nice thing is, at first, you get really good at spotting other people's fallacies. But once you get really good at it, once it becomes second nature, you'll be making an argument one day, and as the words are coming out of your mouth, the alarm bell will go off, oh my God, it's this fallacy.
Right.
No one will need to tell you, and that is a wonderful feeling. It's embarrassing in the moment, but afterwards you go, "Wow, how about that? I just disabused myself by understanding some fallacy." That's a great thing.
Floyd?
Yeah, I guess I just encourage everyone in the great debate community to get familiar with all sorts of fallacies we discussed, and just learn some basic logic skills. Learn the difference between modus ponens, for example, and affirming the consequent. Not that you actually have to know those terms, but just to understand this, how to form a valid argument, and just get familiar with all the fallacies out there. You can just Google logical fallacies, and I'm sure you'll find a site that has a list of a bunch of them. So I encourage everyone to just brush up on logic and try to avoid fallacies.
All right, and Aaron, thanks for joining us this week, man. Hopefully you come back next week as well.
Yeah.
But do you have anything that you want to add before we take this off air?
Yeah. Well, one last point I think Ozzy hit on a little bit is that when you first start learning about them, you start seeing the fallacies in the other side, or either the side that you kind of have like this idea might be wrong, or based on whatever your initial prejudice is. When you start getting good at it, or when you start actually learning them, you start to see that all of these people that I thought were have correct reasoning 99% of the time, their arguments are not so great either. And so I have to really even people that have good reasoning most of the time, it's very, very, very easy to commit the same fallacies that you would easily spot in someone else. But because the person making the argument is either on your side or through some other, some other perception, is it's easy not to spot them when you're not looking for them. That's one reason that debate is so valuable, is because you actually get challenged on the things that you were once, putting forth. And so if you have a fallacy in your reasoning in something fundamental, it's like I have my entire thing is based on an equivocation, then you're not going to spot it when you're in a room full of other people who agree with you and using the same arguments. But the second you try to present that to someone else and they immediately spot it, it's easy not to it's so much easier to see it in someone else. But yeah, it's going to be challenged.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for anybody that was watching this. And we will see you guys later.